Dobrý den, hello. I would like to welcome you today at the second day of our event, which is called Václav Havel European Dialogues. This year's topic is the other Europe, and we've got so many interesting guests and topics that I'm just going to go straight to it. The Other Europe today is a project by Jacques Rupnik about the past of the part of Europe that consisted of communist countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Eastern Germany, and Hungary. We talked to people who witnessed and even played part in the events leading up until today. In the second part of our program, which will be moderated by the director of the Václav Havel Library, Michal Žantovský, we will welcome the woman that most Czechs envy to our Slovak brothers and sisters, the president of Slovakia, Zuzana Čaputová. There will be three academics and an active politician discussing what the other Europe means to them. And after that, we will have a panel dedicated to Belarus and the recent events there, a video and an essay, and there also will be a word by Václav Havel that he dedicated to Belarus in the year 2009. This conference is in English, but the Václav Havel Library will provide Czech and English subtitles, and they will post it on the website. Also, you can ask questions. We would very much appreciate your questions and you taking part in an active discussion. So let us move to the second part of our today's debate. And one thing I forgot. My name is Jana Ciglerová, and I work for Deník N. So now you have the introduction almost complete without the guests. So what is the other Europe? Who are the other Europeans? Who have they been and who they will be? Or will they be? In some ways, my life resembles the life of our future guests. I, just like them, was born in Slovakia to a Czech father and a Slovak mother. I grew up in the Czech Republic, and I don't really consider myself nor full 100% Czech nor full 100% Slovak. I, like many of us, was born in the part of Europe that was defined as the other one. I remember the dominating feeling. I was located in the middle of Europe, yet I did not feel part of it. And I was brought up by parents who knew nothing else but being the other Europeans, the ones that did not somehow count in the big, civilized, real Europe. But in my life, these borders have been slowly disappearing, and for my children, I don't even know if there will be any. And back then, the lines were pretty clear. You were either born in communist country or you were born in capitalist country, and there was nothing in between. But what are the lines today? Is there still the other Europe? And if so, what is it in the eyes of Czechs and Slovaks or Czechoslovakians? So let's discuss all that with the members of a family that has been an active and formative part of our society, and that I mean Czech and Slovak society. And I need to add that in all three generations, Milan, Martin, and Michal Šimečka, the grandfather, the father, and the son, past, present, and future. We will hear from all of them today. Let me introduce them a bit. Milan Šimečka was a dissident, a philosopher, a literary critic who was forced to leave his academic profession after he opposed the communists. He passed away in the year 1990 in September. Martin Šimečka is an author, journalist, and a former editor, and also a man who is one of the most thoughtful and original experts on Czechs, Slovaks, and Czechoslovakia. A son of a Czech father and a Slovak mother, He speaks and writes in both the languages and understands the nation's souls more than anybody I know. And Michal, he's a young politician, a researcher, an international affairs expert, and a co-founder of a political movement, Progressive Slovakia. And since the year 2019, he is also a member of the European Parliament. You cannot get Czech or Slovak family who would better reflect the life and the progress of the Czechs and Slovaks than the Šimečkas. So let us first hear the words of Milan Šimečka, who died too early after the communists had lost the power in Europe.
Who carried out the process of normalization? What were the forces behind it? And where did they find the people to do the job?
Já jsem si vědom, a vy jste si toho vědom taky, kolik, řekněme, sofistikovaných úvah na západě, teda zvlášť v kremlologických institutech, vzniká o tom, jak to všechno bylo. I když to možná teda není úplně správné, tak já si myslím, že se ta věc dá zjednodušit velice na naprosto pochopitelné věci. Ve všech systémech ve východní Evropě se vytváří po těch letech jistý druh privilegované vrstvy. Dylas tomu říká třída. Samozřejmě, že to není třída v marxistickém slova smyslu s těmi vazbami k výrobním prostředkům, ale je to privilegovaná prostě vrstva, která se jako třída chová, která pečuje o svý zájmy, dává na ně pozor, aby nebyly porušeny. To nejsou prostě jenom zájmy moci, to jsou i zájmy, které vytvářejí velice silná, řekněme, hospodářská privilegia. Lidé ve funkcích se mají líp, jak ti, kteří patří k neprivilegovaným třídám. Bylo naprosto zřejmé, že v 68. roce, a teď to řekl taky Dubček ve svém interview, celá řada funkcionářů, lidí, kteří patřili k této privilegované třídě, si uvědomila, že v novém ovzduší by nemusela být zvolena, že by musela odejít z těch privilegií. No a to byli lidi, z kterých teda se rekrutovali vlastně všichni ti, o kterých se mluví, že to bylo zdravé jádro strany. Nic jiného na tom nebylo. Je přirozeně, že mohlo existovat několik idealistů, anebo že jich byly stovky, kteří se domnívali, že toto už není socialismus. Že v podstatě to byl ten samý proces, který vidíte dneska v Sovětském svazu, kde se ukazuje, že ta opozice silná z toho důvodu, že reprezentuje skutečně teda třídu, která má své zájmy.
So, dobrý den, Martine, dobrý den, Michale. Hi, hello there.
Dobrý den, hi.
So thanks so much for the invitation. Indeed, dobrý den všetkým, but let's speak English, and I would just like to say it's indeed an honor to be part of the conversation.
Thank you very much for taking part in it. Now hearing the words of your father, in your case Martin, and your grandfather Michal, would you like to comment on that? How would you reflect on these words? Martina, would you please start?
Well, I think my father was absolutely correct when he discovered all these signals. He saw them years and years before, that this new class is not anymore legitimate in the eyes of the people. And my father, he was famous by that he was kind of a prophet of the end of the communistic regime. The thing is that he believed much more in, not so much in the revolution, but in, especially when he spoke about Gorbachev and the Soviet Union in that time, that actually Czechoslovak regime would also kind of start to change itself. But he didn't expect revolution in '89 or such a fast evolution of or the collapse of the system. But otherwise, well, it's it's great to hear him when he talk about this, because I can't resist to think that he might have through the same today. He actually spoke about the communist class of those privileged. Well, but we have now the same problem in democratic world, where the elite, so-called elite, which is actually the class, is also again hated by the masses, and the populist use that against democracy.
Michal, isn't it weird to hear your grandfather saying the words that are so accurate for today's situation?
Well, it's wonderful. I don't think I've seen the tape before, or at least not the entire segment. And there are two things that strike me from his words, and one is what my father just said. The other thing I would point to, perhaps, and this has been true of his writings and on restoration of order, and the book, and this is the fact that when he's asked, what were the forces behind normalization? Normally, you would say, well, the Soviet tanks, right? Because that's been the force that caused the Prague Spring, to reverse itself and then to bring normalization. But he points to, more subtle sociological forces behind that, and to kind of the more human face of normalization, saying it's not just been the Soviet tanks that have brought normalization or restoration of order, but it's been those functionaries, it's been that class which was unsettled in the 60s and was actually longing for that restoration of order. So it's much more reflective, and it's also self-critical because it points to us, or points to the Czechoslovak society as being also part of that normalization, and not just deflecting blame onto the Soviet tanks, because that's obviously historically it's a fact, but it's also too easy an explanation for what happened in the 70s.
Martin, and if your father mentioned the privileged class, that's not really, we shouldn't really call it a class, but an elite group maybe. Who is the elite group today?
Well, I think it's partially it's meritocracy, which is actually the natural development in all democracies. And we see it in U.S., the class of the rich who adapt the rules for themselves. But we see it in Central Europe. It's a class of oligarchs who, again, set the rules to stay in the power, or to stay in the, or to defend their money and their influence. So yeah, you actually, these people behave in a very similar way as the communist class and the privileged did in the past, and there are many of them, of course, the class of those who either stay in power or they live from serving to the power. So you have a huge number of people who don't actually need democracy to stay in power sometimes, or to have privilege. Sometimes it's even for them better if democracy is not there, because they are much more secure in their privileges. And you see it now in Hungary and Poland very much.
Do you see those signs today in our Czech and Slovak society, Michala?
Yes, of course. I mean, especially in Slovakia. I mean, over the years, under the previous government, I should say, but to some extent, this sort of goes beyond governments. But you had a class of politicians and of oligarchs and of top bureaucrats and prosecutors and judges who indeed form what you can describe as a class who've basically took over the state, and now that their privileges are threatened, many of them are actually under indictments, and you can see that in real time how this particular class is kind of losing its power. but at the same time, you cannot reduce that. You cannot reduce it to one government or one clan. So if we're to use that term, what I should add, and I think my dad is right, but I would also add that, ironically, many of those politicians, not just in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but all across Europe and in the US, who are attacking this elite class of those who've studied at the best universities, of those who have been born to wealth, those who have been in power, those who form sort of the deep state, as they say. Many of those who are these sort of populist insurgents are themselves part of that very class. I mean, Donald Trump is the most famous example, but you have that all over the place. You have that in Slovakia. The politicians, often from the far right, who would say, well, we need to remake democracy to make it work for the people, are impoverished and the elites don't care about them. It's often the liberal elites, by the way. But these people are often the most wealthy and the most privileged of the society. So there's clearly, a disingenuousness on their part, and it's clearly just an attempt to use what is now popular, to the railing against elites, to simply usurp more power.
And Martin, would you say that the class is different in Czech and Slovakia? And have they somehow evolved or morphed into a different group of people during the 30 years after the communism fall?
Yes, I mean, on one hand, and it's a paradox. I mean, Slovak Republic is recognized very often as the very, very corrupted country, which is true. And we have more probably oligarchs than in Czech Republic, but these oligarchs are not actually. They are many of them. Some of them are stronger than the others and richer than the others. But it's not. I would say, in comparing to Czech Republic, and it's fascinating me how Czechs are not so much able to recognize that their country is actually in a more maybe polite and civilized way, actually more corrupted than Slovakia, in a sense that you have a prime minister who is one of the richest men in the republic, and using his money to his power, of course, attacking when coming to power against corruption and against the elites, of course. But he is the most visible elite and a rich class, abusing his power to get richer. Recently, Mr. Petr Kellner, who died recently, was one of uncomparable in terms of influence and wealth to any Slovak oligarchs. I mean, far influent and richer than anybody else in Slovakia. And some, of course, and Mr. Babiš he's much richer than any Slovak oligarch. So I think it's maybe not so visible because the corruption in Czech Republic is, let's say, more civilized. You may have not so much corrupted judges and police. That's true, and it's very nice. On the other hand, the deep link between politics and business, I think in Czech Republic is even deeper than in Slovakia.
Does it mean, Michal, that it will be harder to get rid of it in Czech Republic than in Slovakia? Should we ever want to?
Well, I don't want to comment on the Czech situation as much because I'm not obviously an expert. I don't live in Prague anymore. I think it might be more difficult to get rid of it. In Slovakia, what we're witnessing is actually quite a unique moment in which the government, for all its faults, and I'm quite critical of the Slovak government, this is the part where they seem to got it right. And so what we're seeing is a disintegration of a particular oligarchic political clan, in the span of a few months. And it's going to be interesting also for other countries to see whether this is successful, whether those people who have committed wrongdoings, who've been corrupt and all that, whether they actually end up in jail after the court gives the verdict, but also whether they will be replaced by a different clan, by a different class, by a different oligarchic structure, or whether they will have the power to return at some point in a different electoral cycle. So it's very interesting to watch, because at the moment it seems really that what's often been called the mafia state in Slovakia, or the kind of state capture, is disintegrating, and their people are losing their power, by the minute. And if the big question is if it's actually permanent, and if this is going to be very important also for the Hungarians. Obviously, there are, in Hungary, this is even on a much bigger scale, the kind of regime that Orban and his oligarchs have built with EU money, I have to add. But this is the Slovak experience is interesting for, say, those Hungarian opposition politicians who want to unseat Orban in next year's elections, whether actually it's possible to destroy such an oligarchic structure for good. So the jury is still out on that one.
You studied at Oxford, you work in Brussels. Martin, you've traveled the world, you lived in other countries. Is this oligarchy class, elite, mafia, is it what differentiates us from the civilized world, the part of Europe that we never really belonged to before the fall of communism? Martina, what would you say?
I think it's different, but mostly it's a kind of an optical illusion, because I mean what we see in Central Europe, it's very brutal oligarchy. It reminds more 19th century in the US, because it is sometimes it's violent, sometimes people are killed, as we have seen in Slovakia 2 years ago. So it's obvious. But on the other hand, I think when I read books and what I see, I can't see it by my own eyes, but I can see it. I can read books about it. And I see the impact of that. I mean, the corruption in Great Britain by all British banks in the city laundering dirty money from Russia, Azerbaijan, or whatever, is the scale of that corruption is much bigger than anything in Central Europe. So, of course, it's civilized. It's you go to London, you don't see it. People are not killed there. But I would be very careful to say that Central Europe it's oligarchic society and the West is clean. Well, I wouldn't say that anymore. I believe that maybe in 90s. Now I'm not sure. I think the other kind of corruption sometimes more dangerous because it's not so visible. Actually, in West is there, and I'm pretty afraid of that.
Michal, as somebody that knows the current, yes, please join with your comment on this.
Yes, I would very much agree. I think this is obviously there's a lot of discussion also in the European Union, a lot of criticism of the way Hungary is misusing European funds and corrupting European money and the European project in this way. There's also lots of talk about corruption in Hungary, in Bulgaria and Romania. So you'd get a picture sometimes that it's a Central or Eastern European problem. And I think this is very much a simplified way of looking at things. Not just because much of that corruption, say in Hungary, but also in Slovakia and the Czech Republic, there are big German or other companies which have a direct stake in that system because they've invested so much money into these countries and are intricately linked to those even corruption scandals or to those various webs of influence. So so part of it is also companies operating out of Western Europe or the US. So it's not just our own problem. And the other part is what my father is saying that you have countries like Malta, which and there also a journalist was killed because Daphne Caruana Galizia, because she's trying to uncover the links between the prime minister's office and an oligarch who's in Panama Papers, and she got killed. And we've seen that in Malta. I mean, you have such close closely knit, web of judges, politicians, and prosecutors that you don't even have in Slovakia. So, not to speak of scandals being covered in Austria and in the UK, of course, now with David Cameron. So I don't think it's all that much different. It is perhaps more vivid, more brutal in our part of Europe, but there's also lots of stereotyping there. What I think is different, and this is partly the problem in, say, countries like Poland and Hungary, is the weakness of the institutions of rule of law, which would normally keep that corruption behavior in some sort of check. And when you have those institutions weak, independent judiciary and independent police and independent prosecution, then of course that corruption and that oligarchy can grow to basically get attached to the state and to the ruling political elite much easier.
Martin, you're now in your 60s, so that means half of your life there was a clear line between Europe and the other Europe. We used to call it the Iron Curtain. Is there still a curtain, and is it iron, or has that changed?
Well, there is definitely, it's not iron. I think it's still, the curtain is there in the minds of the people. It's less and less visible, but still, if you travel around the country like Slovakia is, or even Czech Republic, people still, in their thinking, many people think still there are us, there is Europe, or us, Central Europe, Czechs and Slovaks, and then there are the others, like the West, the Europe behind our borders. And that's in the minds of people, which is, especially in the older generation, I think it's with younger people, this problem is going to be smaller and smaller. But yes, it's there. If I talk to people, yes, they still don't feel quite European in a sense, like the legacy and the heritage of, and the memory of the communist past is still there. I don't think they would like to come back to the past. I don't think that they would like to come back to dictatorship. But their mistrust to the West is still there somehow. And I would say that it's a paradox. Slovaks are in this way much more open to Europe than Czechs are. And that's, of course, very difficult question to answer. Why is that in Slovak part or in Czech part? I think Slovaks are in this way clearly pragmaticians. They know they cannot survive alone, and Europe is the best option. So even the very kind of normal people in some Slovak village will tell you, yes, we are part of Europe because we need to be in European Union for our own safety and maybe future for our kids. You don't listen these arguments very much in Czech Republic, which is, and I don't think it's not so much the legacy of communist times or communist regime, but a weird kind of development in Czech Republic in last 20 years against European Union. That many parties were anti-European, but also kind of a legacy which might have to do something with a deeper past of Czech society and Czech nation. I mean, I don't want to go in too much into details, but I think that there is this kind of a Czech feeling of superiority, which it's harder for them to accept that they are just a normal, quite a small European nation, and they need Europe because they could get into troubles.
I told you nobody understands Czechs and Slovaks better than Martin Šimečka. Michal, you were, 5 when the regime collapsed? You were 9 when Slovakia joined the EU. Is it different for you than for your father? Do you view yourself more European than maybe his generation, maybe my generation even?
It's a difficult to compare, but I mean, for me, and I think this is very important to say also, and it's also part of what politicians should be saying. I think that there isn't a tension between being a European or being a Slovak in the sense that your identities, or at least that's the way kind of I've always felt, whether I was in Prague or in the UK or in Brussels, that the European project is precisely about kind of reinforcing those identities. So the fact that I feel more strongly or identify as a European also means, by the same token, that I identify more strongly as a Slovak, and vice versa. I think there's kind of a false dichotomy that lots of politicians and lots of us perhaps have a tendency to feel that, well, either I'm more European or I'm more Slovak. I would say that the beauty of this is precisely that I feel, and this is, by the way, an immigrant story as well, in the sense that I, by leaving Slovakia when I was 18 to study first in Prague and then the UK, I became much more attached to my national identity. But all the same, and at the same time, I became much more attached to the European identity. And I think this is what lots of people don't get about the European Union, is that it actually reinforces our national identities, and in fact even our sovereignty when it comes to that. And this I think is partly the problem when you ask before whether we are still in the EU or in Europe, whether Czechs or Slovaks still feel kind of as behind the Iron Curtain, whether the curtain is still there in some mental state, whether we feel as second-class citizens. I think part of it is that we still aren't able to say that we are, we can be assertive as Slovaks or as Czechs on the European stage. We can clearly say what our interests are, how we would want the European Union to go, but that doesn't mean that we lose our attachment to Europe. So the problem is that we are kind of still either very passive, Slovakia, and I'm saying either very passive vis-a-vis our partners in the EU, that we kind of accept whatever decision is made in Brussels or in Berlin or whatever. That's most of the time. Or then every now and then we're kind of aggressively kind of against something, be it whatever we don't like. But we are either passive and just taking in the decisions, or abruptly and kind of childishly protesting against something and banging on the table. And I think we need to find some middle ground where we're actually constructive, but also assertive and aware that we are the same kind of Europeans as the Germans or the Portuguese or the Danes. And there are member states, even from behind the Iron Curtain, who are able to do that, such as Estonia, for instance. So I think this is what we should be striving for.
We've already got some questions from our viewers, so I will ask the first one that somehow reflects what we've just been talking about. Do you think that active civil society could be the key how to get rid of corruption in the Czech Republic? Martin?
Well, definitely, I think active society is the only relevant tool for all positive changes in any society. So yes, but we have seen in Czech Republic 2 years ago these million moments for democracy, the movement with organizing huge demonstrations. Nothing very much changed. So sometimes it's difficult because the results will come very late for many people who wish them to have soon. But actually, the same it's all the time the same story. I mean, one of my deepest experience from my youth, from communist times, is that you just have to do that, and you have to build a civic society, or you have to defend your freedom and to be active as much as you can. Not very much thinking about how deep and how soon the impact will be. It's just your obligation to do that. And then the experience is, yes, the day will come and you will succeed, but you never know when.
Michal, are we active societies? Are Czechs, Slovaks, are we the post-communist countries, are we active societies, or we're more rather passive because we don't expect the change, as your father just said?
I think there are moments when we're incredibly active and when there's a lot of energy. I mean, of course, in the Czech Republic, the Milion Chvilek pro demokracii, but also in Slovakia, after the murder of Jan Kuciak and Fiance, I mean, the civil society kind of erupted with energy and political activism. So I think there, as always, and this is not just about Slovakia and the Czech Republic. In most societies, you have periods of civic mobilization and activeness and participation, and then you have perhaps longer periods of time where people are, not to say passive, but are not as engaged with politics, and that's normal. I mean, you can't expect a society to be mobilized all the time. I mean, people have their lives to live, but what you see, and I think this is the big global story of the past years, is that public protests and especially those protests which are demanding transparency and an end to corruption and authoritarian practices. I mean, we're seeing it all over the world, from Hong Kong to Belarus, and I think if anything, this kind of gives me some hope that despite democracy being in retreat in most places in the world, most continents, that kind of civic engagement and civic activism is still very much alive, and it has proven very successful to some degree in Slovakia. We'll see about the Czech Republic, but I wouldn't say that Slovakia or Czech Republic are passive, especially not in the last couple of years.
Now, you both come from this unique family where each of the past 3 generations are very socially, politically active. What did they put in your water? How did that happen? How did your father, Martin, affect you? And why did you, Michal, started to be so active in a public life? How does one do that if I want to have my sons being as active as you guys are?
Well, I think I was just lucky to be born to my father, because he was a man who, I mean, even in a family life, we just had been debating all the time, and it was fascinating because he was a very kind and passionate man who discussed all the time. And so it came to my blood. Not talking about that I was just the regime actually put me in a situation that I actually had to become a dissident because I had no other option. But especially it was important for me that I just had this luxury of talking to my father whenever I wanted, and he was very passionate about that, and he had a lot of friends who were, I mean, very nice too in all these dissident groups. So it just for me was so formative that I would say that one thing which was very important was that all my father's visions and thoughts were backed by a very strong moral sense. So it wasn't about being pragmatic or he was brilliant analytic, but basically his attitude was moral. It wasn't about what is efficient, what is successful or not. I mean, his basic attitude was moral, and that actually I found for my whole life very formative. And I just can say, well, it's just the life when you look at the world through the moral optics is just very interesting. You can, and it's. I think it's boring to be pragmatic, and my father never was, so he was kind of romantic, and I like it very much.
And was this political future? Your son grew up mostly in a free country. Was it something you had in mind for him, or you influenced him, or you thought, no, get out of politics, don't even get there? What was in your mind?
Well, I didn't. Well, I have to say that in my family was even. I mean, my wife is also very eloquent political thinker. Actually, we have very strong moral instinct too. So it's not my. I think my influence of my wife and Misha's mother was even bigger. I can't. He has to say. Well, Misha from his childhood was. Well, he was part of all these debates when our friends came to our garden. So he listened to them. Sometimes got asleep by that, but so it's probably also came to his blood somehow. He has to say.
Talking about you, Michal, now it's your time to say the truth. What
Well, of
made
course,
you
I mean,
become
if
an
you,
active
you know,
politician? Sorry.
I mean, of course, if you grew up kind of in a family where most of the time, you know, there are discussions of politics and of you know, issues of society, then it's very difficult to escape that. And I wanted to escape that. I wanted to be a professional football player, but that just wasn't good enough. But there are two things I would say. One is that that obviously every family kind of background and upbringing sort of forms who you are. And in this particular case, it was not just the talk about politics in society and all that, but it was kind of the notion that it is normal to care about things that are beyond your individual needs or your individual career. That it is absolutely the default option is to do something which is for a greater good or a public good. So I, for instance, I never thought, and I still don't think I would ever go into business or any such career. So that was one thing. But then, I mean, and this is the other thing I wanted to stress, that whereas, you know, my grandfather and my dad were kind of these strong intellectuals, personalities are, my sense of politics and also the reason why I got into politics was not because I saw myself as this kind of, you know, heroic figure that needs to save the country. But it was because I was doing it with my friends and colleagues who founded Progressive Slovakia, and it was that collective enterprise. For me, politics, or at least entering to politics, was very much a collective exercise. Then I would never, without Progressive Slovakia being born at the time when I was returning from my studies, I would have never you know, entered politics by myself. It was precisely the fact that there were people whom I respected, who were friends of mine, who said at one point that we should do this together and start a new movement. By the way, Zuzana Čaputová was part of that, who's now the president. So I think this is I was always trying to say, this is what people often forget about politics, that political parties and movements are collective, and you enter politics or not also because you find the right people to do it with, and with the same kind of goals and the same vision.
Martin, would you explain to us why progressive political movement like Progressive Slovakia has succeeded in Slovakia, but the progressive powers in Czech Republic are in nowhere near as strong as in Slovakia? Why is that?
Well, I think first thing is, and Misha is right, that there was a group of people who started this with an idea that it was a generational idea. We want to live in this country for the future and with our children, and we have to change it if that's our obligation. And this kind of group of people, sometimes it just happens. So and in Czech Republic, I mean, a little bit similar. Something could be pirates but they are. It's different. It's different part, and there are different ideas. But still, it kinds of a generational feeling, and maybe probably some collective brain or feeling. The other thing is that, well, Slovakia is actually a conservative country, much more than Czech Republic, a society. So sometimes it's typical that in conservative country there are stronger liberal movements because it's a reaction on the atmosphere in the society. So the Progressive Slovakia, well, it was successful in bringing to the presidential castle Zuzana Čaputová. There was big achievement of Progressive Slovakia. The other was the elections into European Parliament, where actually they won. Well, on the other hand, the failure last year in the parliamentary election, they didn't get into the parliament because they got only 7% until very, very, well, some hundreds votes were missing to get into the parliament. So it was unlucky, but there was a failure too. So the question is, I would say now Progressive Slovakia is, again, Slovakia is a little bit kind of a laboratory for the political processes and social processes. And Progressive Slovakia can be one of those, whether the modern European liberal political party can succeed in Central Europe and be a potential leading force in a future, not now, but at least successful enough to influence political life. And I think that's actually that's why Progressive Slovakia is a very interesting case. Well, of course we will see, and which it's kind of a responsibility for that party to to succeed because to to be an example of success for the others in Central Europe.
Michal, do you agree with this output?
I agree that it's that as a part that as a party we had our successes, but we also failed in the biggest and most important elections of all, which is the national elections, and in a way, I'm not saying it's good because that's never good for a political party, but it kind of taught us perhaps to be a bit more humble and to not take especially polls for granted, and most importantly, when we founded the movement and we sort of came together, it was always meant to be a project that is long term, that is not just for one electoral cycle, but that should survive its founders and should be for generations to come, or at least for several electoral cycles. And at the time, there were similar, and there still are similar movements. For instance, in Hungary, there's Momentum, which is now I think the second or third most successful opposition party against Orban. So, and this is also generational. People in their 30s and 40s, very much liberal, green, pro-European. To be frank, I mean, in the Czech Republic, I see a lot of that in the Pirates, although they're also in the European political structures. They are in the Green movement, whereas we're part of the kind of the liberal political family. I think there are many similarities, and it is a generational shift in Central European politics, which you see to some extent already in kind of countries further west, like Germany and Austria. And in Germany in particular, you see the success of the Greens and how they've been getting stronger and stronger over the years. And my sense and my hope is that this is also going to come to Central Europe and Slovakia in particular, that this kind of politics will gain more and more appeal and more voters.
So I have now more questions from our viewers. There's one that is asking, what are the main pillars of maintaining a democratic society in the future? Is there a way to guarantee democracy? Martin, what would you say?
Well, that's a very difficult question. If I can have an answer, I would be I can get a Nobel Prize. But well, of course, when we spoke about civil society, there is a question whether there are these things you need to keep democracy sustainable, and it's of course, as Misha already said, institutions, independent institutions, and institutions where are qualified people. It's from judiciary to actually state administrative, which we have seen today in the pandemic how our states, Czech and Slovak, by the way, both in the same way, failed because in the 30 years of democracy, we were not able to create a professional and good state administrative. But all this is, of course, important. But actually it's a question of belief, and I know that democracy is somehow in its retreat in a major part of the world. And instead of now, Mr. Orbán is talking about that liberal democracy is dead, and actually democracy itself, I mean, is now, which he means, of course, he doesn't say it's authoritarian regime somehow, but it's democratic in a sense. They still have elections, sometimes rigged, sometimes not, and they play the system as democratic. But I still believe in liberal democracy. And I believe in that, and especially in the countries like ours, and European mostly, because I think people finally they see the benefit of that, the benefit of freedom and democracies. Actually, the most of those regimes which turned into be authoritarian are now in a situation like communist regimes have been. In a beginning, people were might have been excited about it, but slowly they got feeling that the regime is not theirs and is not effective, by the way. So I still believe in liberal democracy, and I believe in whatever. And I think my father would actually, maybe it's herited from him. I mean, this kind of optimism. Which is not, I don't think it's stupid optimism. I think it's a rational optimism. But we Czechs and Slovaks have one advantage, and that's why I believe in democracy in our country, is that we have this legacy of First Republic in Czechoslovakia from 20s, which is very strong, and we sometimes forget it, that how strong this legacy is. And I think that's one of the reasons why Czechs and Slovaks are still democratic, although with all these problems. And Hungarians and Poles who had not that kind of experience before the Second World War, and they have different past. That's why they struggle so much to keep democracy, especially now in Poland. The battle is still open. But in the long term, I still believe that even Poles and Hungarians will succeed defending democracy. So, I'm sorry that I have not an answer how to do that. I think that one thing is, I mean, belief, and I wouldn't think it's a strong instinct, and you have to believe in that. And I think many people just will fight for that in all the civic NGOs, whatever. And I have seen so many times in Slovakia that it was almost nobody believed we could repair democracy. It was in the 90s. Then it was the era of Robert Fico. Well, and look now. I mean, it's a mess, but it's democratic mess.
So if Martin Šimečka tells you that the democracy will survive in Czech and Slovakia, you should take his word for that. Michal, the last word, we only have a few seconds left. So would you be as optimistic as your father about the future of these two countries?
Yes, I would, of course. Not just because of the legacy, which is obviously there, also because of the European Union, which to some extent is not, in fact, it might not be a full guarantee, but it helps for democracies to survive. And I still hope you would also see that work in Poland and Hungary. But most importantly, I would say that what the threats to democracies today is not, some authoritarian takeover or some putsch or whatever, or coup d'etat. It's more like there will be elections in which a populist, nationalist, authoritarian-leaning politician would win, and then those would be the last free and fair elections, because suddenly he would start to dismantle those institutions which are meant to be independent of the state. He would attack the media, shrink the civic space, and then tilt the the rules of the game. So this is a global story. This is how democracies, as the famous book says, this is how they die, not by some sudden kind of collapse or overthrow. So therefore, you need those institutions to guarantee, and this is what liberal democracy is. It's not about liberalism in the sense of sexual rights. It's about protection of minorities, and the protection of civil liberties guaranteed by independent institutions, which sets this apart from electoral autocracies such as that we are seeing also in Central Europe now. So, of course, you need institutions, but also, this is where I'll close. The survival of democracies now will depend on how they deliver. Be it on more equitable social economic growth, be it on the environment, be it on managing a pandemic. All of these things will ultimately decide whether people will have that belief in democracy. Obviously, people will want freedom, and you see it in Belarus, whatever, and they would fight for it. But they would also need to see that democratic politics actually delivers. And I think, for instance, we can look at what Joe Biden is doing in the US with his economic policy. I think that's precisely the kind of thing that also strengthens democracy and people's trust in democratic institutions.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the fascinating debate we had. Thank you, viewers, for being with us in the first panel. Now, in short while, I will invite to the floor the president of the Václav Havel Library, Michal Žantovský, and everything will be online. Check our website and send us some questions. Thank you very much.
Well, hello again. I am now very proud to have the opportunity to introduce the keynote speaker of our closing session. She's someone I have a great admiration for, although you could say that we have some differences. She is a Slovak, I'm a Czech. She is a woman, I'm a man. She is a head of state, I'm a librarian. But despite all the differences, we share the same values, the same awareness of history, and the same admiration for the man who inspired these dialogues, Václav Havel. It is now my honor to present the President of the Slovak Republic, Her Excellency Zuzana Čaputová.
Dear Mr. Žantovský, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, today we will discuss not only why the division of Europe is once again becoming a reality. We will also contemplate why this division no longer takes place only between countries, but also within each of them. Our answer to what can be done to reverse this trend is very important, and I appreciate being able to voice my opinion in front of this noble auditorium. Especially today, I observe that this new division is not two-dimensional. Instead of polarization, it's more accurate to talk about fragmentation of societies and communities. In recent years, there has been a clear shift. Even those people who share values find themselves standing against each other as a result of multiple dividing lines. This is due to a number of factors. One, if not the main one, is the growing presence and influence of social media. They offer an illusion of knowledge on various issues. They offer an illusion of expertise and reinforce the propensity to have an opinion on everything. Equally, they create a sense of belonging to a group which share the same views, one that is different, more correct, and better than the rest. Fragmentation weakens the cohesion of society, and weak social cohesion is a direct threat to democracy. The essence of this phenomenon is largely natural. The premise for division are differences, whereas differences or diversity is not only natural, but in democracy even welcome and necessary. So, why is this natural quality of democracy becoming its threat? Diversity can benefit the whole only if it respects otherness, if it does not destroy or deny the others. Thus, unity doesn't exclude diversity, and with mutual respect, diversity is enriching. This requires the will to understand the starting points of a different opinion group is a precondition for its acceptance. And subsequently, it is a precondition for convergence. Still, it is necessary to distinguish the level of value and opinion differences. We can overcome the fragmentation of our societies if we become more aware of value conformity wherever possible, and if we take opinion differences as enrichment. Thus, we need to be united on value basis with respect for the diversity of opinions. Of course, this only applies where the overlap of values is possible at all. The role of leaders, and not only political leaders, is extremely important in efforts to strengthen cohesion. It's up to all of us to choose whether we put our energy into building differences or if in our thoughts, words, and actions we decide to build upon what unites, whether we act inclusively or exclusively, whether we are building bridges or widening gaps. Even political pragmatism, which is becoming so dominant, doesn't have to be in fundamental conflict with ideology, values, or principles. Pragmatism seeks compromises in the way we promote values effectively. What doesn't seek anything is populism, because that reduces everything to its own short-term and often reckless interest. Populism only pretends ideas, values, and principles. The result is a social system disrupted by fragmentation and torn apart by resentment, which has a problem coping with the new great challenges of our times. 43 years ago, in a completely different era, Václav Havel wrote his essay, The Power of the Powerless. Its timeless legacy read as follows: even if you cannot change the world yourself, act as if you had the power to do so. I consider this legacy of dissident Václav Havel not only to be profound, but also affirmed by life. He formulated it at a time that seemed dark and hopeless, but as it turned out, it was surmountable. I am convinced that today's crisis, which is also manifested in the emergence of a different Europe across the old continent, is just as manageable, but only if Havel's imperative once again finds enough determined and energetic followers. I believe that today's conference and its excellent participants, with their original ideas and reflections, will surely help make them happen. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you, Madam President. This was wonderful. My takeaway from this is, even if you cannot change the world, act as if you had the power to do so. Václav Havel and Zuzana Čaputová. And there is a lot to change, and not much time to do it. So let us speak about the current divisions, which President Čaputová described as fragmentation rather than polarization. Let us speak about the factors contributing to the fragmentation. The President mentioned the social media and the populist trends, but surely they are not the only issues. Let us speak about the ways to overcome the fragmentation. We will all agree with the President that tolerance of the diversity of opinions and respect for the other should play a role. But how do we persuade those who have little tolerance of diversity and no respect for it? And let us speak of what President Čaputová openly described as the present crisis of Europe. Of course, everybody is now speaking about the COVID crisis, but my impression is that what she had in mind was not just that. And let us speak about the solution. Should we try to educate people for tolerance, respect more diversity, act with a degree of pragmatism, build bridges, paper over differences, or should we try to win the others to our point of view? And if the latter, how do we find a common ground for debate when that very ground suffers from fragmentation? Should we seek reconciliation or conversion? And ultimately, if we can't build a single Europe today, how many Europes we can live with, politically, economically, spiritually? To answer these and many other questions, including those that come in from the audience on Slido, we have a panel of experts whose common denominator is intellectual brilliance and value-based leadership, people we often look to for answers, opinions, and guidance. In the alphabetical order, they are Timothy Garton Ash, historian, author, and commentator, Professor of European Studies at the University of Oxford. Welcome, Tim. Maria Neuer, Maria Neuer, Professor for Political Science at the University of Hildesheim and President of the International Political Science Association. Welcome, Professor Neuer. Ivan Krastev, political scientist, the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia and permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. Ivan, it's always a pleasure. And my countrywoman, Olga Richterová, Czech linguist, translator, and politician, deputy president of the Committee for Social Policy in the Chamber of Deputies of the Parliament of the Czech Republic. Well, Tim, you have the dubious privilege both of seniority and of alphabetical preference, so why don't you start?
Well, thank you, Michael. It's lovely to be with you all in this virtual Prague. I want to kick off by interrogating the title of this session, which is, I believe, The Other Europe Today. You know, when the notion of the other Europe was launched, mainly by intellectuals of Central European origin in France, people like Jacques Rupnik, Pierre Asner, Pierre Kenda, Alexander Smolar, their idea was Europe is not just Western Europe, it's also the other Europe behind the Iron Curtain, let's not forget about it. So this was an intellectual predecessor of the notion of Central Europe, which Václav Havel, Milan Kundera, Georgi Konrad, I in a modest way in the New York Review of Books and others promoted in the 1980s. It seems to me now, when people use this term, the other Europe has become the othered Europe, or the othering of Eastern Europe. In other words, people talk about what's happening in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Poland, Hungary, in the way that people in the Enlightenment and many times since have talked about Eastern Europe as if it is one homogeneous block of countries which never really belonged to the true liberal post-Enlightenment Europe. And what's happening in Poland and Hungary, they say, is basically that these countries have gone back to their bad old, tendentially authoritarian and vaguely barbaric ways, right? So it is actually not the other Europe, but the othering of Eastern Europe once again. And as Zuzana Chaputova not only says, but personifies, this is clearly no longer the case at all, if it ever was. After all, Nigel Farage would be quite at home in Viktor Orban's Hungary, and Marine Le Pen would be quite at home in Jarosław Kaczynski's Poland. The truth is, there's not the division of Europe. There are now the divisions of Europe, multiple divisions of Europe. Crucially, the ones President Chaputova talked about down the middle of our own societies. Václav Havel talked about the line going through the middle of every citizen in a post-totalitarian society. Well, now there's a line going through the middle of all our societies, Britain, France, Germany, Netherlands, just as much as the Czech Republic or Slovakia. The North-South divide, as important as the East-West. Brexit as a major new rupture. divide and rule by China. There are multiple divisions across this Europe, no longer just one. It seems to me that the peculiar feature of East Central Europe is that the issue is precisely democracy, that nationalist populists have been in power for longer in Poland and Hungary, and the actual erosion of democracy has gone further, particularly in Hungary, but also in Poland, than elsewhere. So the questions for us are, number one, why is that? Number two, what do we do about it in these countries? And number three, is my old friend Michał Szymeczka actually right that the EU helps in preventing the erosion of democracy? Over the last decade, it's not at all clear. One could even argue that in some ways the EU has facilitated the erosion of democracy in Hungary in particular. So those, I think, the questions before us, not one divide, but many divides, and what we do about them.
Well, Tim, thank you so much. It's not surprising, because we've known each other for a long time, that yesterday at the opening of the conference I said something very similar. I talked about the many other Europes within and without, not least your own country, which is now another other Europe, and also because we sometimes think of the European Union as co-synonymous with Europe. We should never forget about the other Europes out there in the east of us, in the Southwest Balkans, and ultimately even Russia itself. So, Professor Neuer, which of the other Europes would you like to take up?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank the organizers for having me here, and it's indeed an honor to participate in an event that carries the name of Václav Havel. And I think it's really worthwhile to listen his words, especially about democracy until now and until today. So I absolutely agree to President Čaputová, what she said about polarization and divides, and I also absolutely agree to my colleague Timothy Garton-Ash in referring to the multiple divides. But maybe I would like to give a more or less pessimistic perspective on this issue in two regards. One perspective might be that now taking a different perspective, not regarding the divisions within Europe, but rather looking over the Atlantic and having, so to say, the perspective from outside of Europe, we might think that comparing, if we want to do so, the degree of polarization and of divisions, and comparing this, for example, with the example of the United States, which we know is a highly, highly polarized society, we have still, and this is maybe the more, positive message to this, I would say that Europe still is not at the same height of polarization, fragmentation, as President Čaputová said. And I would invite us to take this maybe as a more positive message, and at the same time ask ourselves if we might draw lessons and out of this negative example this time, and once the United States is might serve as a negative example, and draw lessons out of this example, asking ourselves how can we avoid that this kind of deep polarization, fragmentation, which we observe at the other side of the Atlantic, can be avoided, and what lessons can we draw in our societies to do so. And the other perspective I want to introduce here is, of course, we have to ask ourselves, what does this pandemic mean for this phenomenon and this diagnosis of polarization and fragmentation in our European societies for the post-COVID situation, so to say. And again, here I would say that also maybe in a less pessimistic way, that actually all European countries are confronted with this challenge and with this way of coping with the impact of the pandemic for a post-COVID period, which means that all the countries in the same degree and at the same level, and here we are not different in any way, north, south, west, east, all of the European countries, each European country has to examine what possible impact this crisis might have on its democratic structures, its democratic institutions, its procedures, and so on. And also on the polarization of the societies. That means, does this pandemic rather heal such fragmentations because the societies were invited to rally, invited to show solidarity in face of this pandemic? Or does it rather stir and strengthen the fragmentation and so make it even deeper? So this is, in my perspective, an open question. We still do not know, and it might be that the experience of solidarity we felt, and all the citizens and societies in this pandemic felt, might give us a different turn to this very delicate and endangering phenomenon of polarization.
Thank you. A note of optimism is always needed, and even more so these days. So perhaps we are a little less polarized than our American cousins. We certainly seem to kill each other less often than it happens over there. But, I wouldn't stretch it too far. I mean, I'm not talking just about my own country, but if you look at France, if you look at Britain and Scotland, if you look at other places around Europe, the polarization, and you have in Germany an election coming up, which I suppose will be also quite polarized. So I think it's best to watch it. And on the post-pandemic future, Ivan, you're kind of an expert on that. You've written extensively on the post-pandemic future. So give us a little of your crystal ball.
Thank you. Listen, it's very easy to be an expert on something that has not happened yet, because it takes time before you understand that you're wrong. But first, I really very much want to agree with President Chaputova, with Tim Gartner, with everybody that in a certain way there is no other Europe anymore. And there is no other Europe because the major divides, even if you go on the level of political values, is not between East and West. The major divides in Europe is between the big metropolitan cities and the other parts of the countries. The major divides are also generational. And from this point of view, there is a certain Central European and East European exceptions, which I want basically try to push you for, because one of the stories to try to see this country is very different, because they are. I very much agree that just to talk about Visegrad 4 or even putting Bulgaria, Slovenia, Romania there, and believe that we're seeing the same process is very misleading. Even Poland and Hungary are very different. You can dislike what is happening there, but many of the processes are very different. But what I see, interestingly enough, is exactly because the problem is also generational conflict. There are two things that I find important. One is that 1968 had a kind of a different generational dynamics in East and West of Europe, being equally important for Eastern Europe and for Western Europe. and Václav Havel will know this better than any of us because he was part of this generation. In 1968, the young have prevailed in the West. Culturally, politically, basically, they set the tone. In Eastern Europe, it was the war generation that prevailed. In a certain way, the young has to wait for 25 years to become not so young in order basically to get their ideas and their politics prevailing. And in my view, this is quite important because what we see, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, and what makes me kind of slightly nervous is the following. In this kind of an important generational dynamics, which we see with different issues, be it climate change, be it tolerance towards sexual minorities and others, the biggest problem is that in Europe, young generation is a minority group. Unlike in 1968, it's a small generational cohort. They don't have the numbers. And numbers matter. And numbers matter, and Tim Gartanesh will know it better than anybody because of the Brexit. If you see how different basically the vote is going to be if younger people have been more. And as a result of it, you're not simply that you have not enough young people in Central and Eastern Europe, but many of them are quite ready to leave the country. And here comes one of the strengths of the political regimes that we're talking about. Facing the classical Hirschman dilemma of exit or voice, for many young Europeans, exit is a much easier option. If I don't like what is happening in our countries, why to try to change it politically when I can go to other parts of Europe and I'm going to feel very much at home? So paradoxically, the existing of common Europe, the fact that we can move freely, make it easier for people like Viktor Orban or Kuczynski to try to consolidate their base. And I'm saying this because, and this is my last point, there is also a question how much political diversity European Union can live with. And here there is a positive sign and negative sign. If you see at the United States in the 1950s, and if you see the democracy in some of the southern states in the 1950s, comparing what is happening in a much more liberal states, we should probably confess that Kaczynski is a classical liberal compared to some of the Alabama governors of the 1950s. So obviously, even in the United States, he's been very much living with quite a lot of political diversity, and nevertheless, the country basically has been functioning. But the difference is, and here comes the Orban case, which is slightly different than Kaczynski case, that in European Union, because of the institutional design of the Union, you need one or two countries that basically can block the Union. And they can block it on many ways. And I do believe of what we are seeing today, and I see this very interestingly also, the way also Orban is not simply trying to keep his power on the elections, but try to make elections meaningless. Because if you're going to, in a way, privatize the universities, if you're going to put a China university at the end in order to protect you against any kind of a liberal influences coming from the other parts of Europe, if you're basically going to control businesses, then who wins elections becomes less important. And I do believe this kind of a story of how Europe can function, not simply because there are divisions within the societies, but when one or two countries basically have the institutional power to block the process of Europe as a whole.
Well, a sobering thought. It's called state capture, I believe, that we are talking about here, and even more so, society capture that we should be afraid of. But I'm amazed how organically this debate evolves, because you mentioned, Ivan, some of the divisions other than political divisions, in particular the social and demographic divisions, city versus country, the generational conflict, and in Deputy Richterová, we have an expert on social issues and on inequality and divisions that also have plagued European societies for some time. So please.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I feel very honored to be here, and I feel a bit humbled because I'm not an academic anymore. I used to be one. Now I am just a politician, you know, swimming in the daily current of daily media events. And I was really thinking hard about what to bring to this debate, because I am a person representing a certain cosmopolitan generation of these young Europeans. I'm 36, I have 2 children, and I am one of those who refused to leave their country. As a young politician, I made the decision to try to change things for the better in my country. So this is just a short introduction. And I was thinking, when I look back, when I reflect on the past 30 years, which I can remember, and I've been a political person ever since, like since a very early childhood, I must say. I feel these 2 feelings, like pride for what Europe has accomplished, and disappointment. Simply, there is a lot of room for improvement. However, I thought of bringing a specific issue to illustrate my point that I would like to bring here. And maybe just to begin with, I would like to say that I feel proud of the way we have managed as Europe to grow together. But as has been stated by several of you before, this prosperity and freedom that Europe has brought to many of us is not the experience of everybody. And of course, that's a problem. So on the other hand, there's also this disappointment that after a relatively successful beginning, we seem to be witnessing a sort of, fragmentation, maybe not disintegration, but fragmentation at the moment. Okay. But I was thinking, democracy, freedom, values, these are big words for many. And in my quest for building a more equal society, maybe in my quest for fair social policy in politics, I was witnessing many times how little impact these big values have on people and how much they value deeds, what we do and how societies live, what we embody as societies by our actually day-to-day culture, everyday business, I would say. So here is a point I'd like to bring up on a very unusual example, a point that is showing the still remaining gap between our European countries and not necessarily between the old Europe and the new one. But it's a point about it's something that Ivan Krastev has described before and in the newest book, as far as I know. It's a point about this mistake of modeling things on the West, of looking towards the West as something that's the model. And people in my country, I think, sometimes see that there are a number of things that in a way went too far. And to illustrate this point of mine, and now I will be very short, I want to bring up the issue of breastfeeding. It's a well-known fact that breast milk provides children with precious protection against infections, type 1 diabetes, obesity later in life, etc. Many beneficial factors. Why am I talking about this at an intellectual event like this? It's because I realized how little attention we pay to these, let's say, primal aspects of our culture, even though it's scientifically proven that a certain practice, here, for example, as an illustration, extended breastfeeding, is very helpful for both the emotional and physical development of the child, of the family. It benefits the mother as well. And now we have the practice, the deeds that people see. And that is that in some Western countries, putting 2-3-month-old babies in a nursery and stopping nursing is considered normal. And you can see there is this vast gap, a huge difference between what science says and what's the daily business, what's the culture. And please, don't get me wrong, I totally respect other people's choices. I'm all for work-life balance. I myself am a working mother of two, but it's this word balance I wish to emphasize. What I'm making now is this plea for balance in our common Europe. And that is simply when we model a certain aspect of our life and look up to other countries, such as those where housework is shared much more equally between partners, for example, then maybe we should not forget that there are also things that ought to stay as they are, such as the right of a mother to have a little bit more time, that special time with her child, if she wants to. Of course, there always must be the individual's choice. So I believe that is this special time shared by mother and child that should be probably neither so long as it's imposed by our culture at the moment and expected from women in my country, nor should it perhaps be so short as it has become in some other countries. And to sum this up, I'm looking forward to being able to find balance in aspects of everyday life so that in the end we can say we are not just a society which publishes so many pages of research, but also a Europe that can implement its values and its scientific findings in everyday life. It was an unusual example, I know, but I think it illustrates the point how different Europe can be. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for a very original contribution, Deputy Richterová. The political analysts among us will recognize that we moving dangerously close to a debate on Occidentalism, which we may still get to. But before we do, let me ask you one question. It seems to me that we are at an inversion point. For the last 20 years, we have been alternately applauding or grumbling about the developments in the European Union and in Europe and in the world, but basically we were quite happy with how things were going. This has now changed because of two reasons, and they came simultaneously. One, Europe and large parts of the world have finally decided to address the issue of the climate change in a strategic way, and that's a transformational issue. And the other, not of our own choosing, we became confronted with the pandemics and what it entails and what it means for the future. And although some people believe that once we all get vaccinated, we will go back to business as usual, I, for one, do not believe so. I believe it's another transformational issue. And they both come simultaneously. Can we cope with both of them at the same time? Are they reinforcing each other? Are they complicating each other, or are they synergizing each other? I think about it all the time, and I would so much like to know what you think. Did I ask the wrong question?
No, I think we do not know who should start and who not, or how the.
Don't be shy. Don't be shy. I don't know. I stopped. I'm not a teacher. it's a free for all now.
Okay, maybe I start simply. So then, first of all, I think you're totally right. We're coming from one crisis to the other. So actually, Europe experienced in the last decade already now the third crisis. We started with the euro and debt crisis. Then we came to the so-called migration crisis in 2015. And now a few years later, we are already in the next crisis, which is a mega crisis, unprecedented crisis with the pandemic. And at the same time, and already having started, we are confronted with a climate crisis, so to say. So actually, I'm convinced that we are already being still in this pandemic crisis. We are already in the climate crisis. So if ever we will leave and come to a post-COVID period, I'm, as you are, convinced that this will not be the same as before. We will be changed dramatically in a lot of regards, politically, economically. I think this has a big impact on society. It has an impact on digitalization and on the impetus of introducing more digital tools and so on. And it will also so to say, immediately transfer us to the next crisis we have to tackle, namely the climate crisis. We are already, again, in this crisis, but we will have to, so to say, tackle the transformation from the COVID-19 crisis, and at the same time, we have to cope with the climate crisis. So I think this is really a huge burden all European countries have on their shoulders. And this is, again, an argument for saying we are not so others. So this is kind of, yes, we are, of course, diverse, and there are divisions also maybe in Europe, but at the same time, the challenge of the two crises and tackling them at the same time is the same for us all. So maybe, and again, here's my, in all these crises, a kind of optimistic perspective. Maybe this is something which binds us together in Europe, because we know that the two crises, tackling them at the same time is impossible without some kind of togetherness and a common understanding and common policy.
Well, ever the optimist, but if I play the avvocato diavoli for a while, the record so far on how we've coped with the latest crisis is not awful, but also not so great. So I want to stick to the topic of the panel. So the meaning of my question was, are these two crises and the combination going to augment the fragmentation, the divisions of Europe, or are they an opportunity to bring us closer together? Ivan.
Thank you very much. There was this children's book in which the main character get out of the room and jump on the horse and start riding off in all directions at the same time. So from this point of view, what I'm afraid of is that if you're looking at the pandemic, one of the things that is really kind of quite depressing is that you have a type of a crisis that where you expect a quite strong incentive for countries to cooperate. Of course, after the initial shock, when you were closing down and so on, you expect that you should cooperate more because this is one of the crises that you cannot solve on its own. Even if you're going to vaccinate all of your population, if the other part of the world is not vaccinated, if a kind of a new variants are happening all the time, you're going to be very much vulnerable. And unfortunately, what should make us kind of a worry about talking about a big environmental crisis and how we are going to respond to two things. As a result of this crisis, not simply we didn't see as much cooperation as you can expect. But secondly, a kind of major geopolitical confrontation and polarization have been strengthened. As a result of this crisis, basically the competition between the United States and China, for example, have been very much accelerated. It was not kind of slowed down. And I'm saying this because I see two major risks for the Europe today. One is that because of the pandemic, we're infected also with nostalgia. Just going back to where we were is going to be seen as a change. And then we're going to be happy with this change, and we're going to talk about resilience. But the border between resilience and decay, in my view, is a border that is not well guarded. And from this point of view, it's quite interesting, and I very much agree that Europe, for the first time because of the pandemic, looked around the world and we didn't like what we saw, particularly in the beginning, during the Trump, America not being present as a leader. We saw kind of a lot of fragmentation and a lot of kind of a hegemonic powers around us. But if we're not going to see the fact that they're not simply going to be so easy to reconcile, on one level, the idea of the system competition that comes both from Brussels and Washington with respect to China, with respect to Russia. And on the other side, the incentives that when it comes to environmental policies, when it comes to climate change, you need countries like China, you need almost everybody else. This is not easy to be reconciled. And I don't believe that because of the climate change, the tensions between states are going to disappear. The tensions between political systems are going to disappear. And the biggest story for Europe is that we have been much more than anybody else believing that economic interdependence creates security. And now some of these our fundamental assumptions is challenged. We can see also that economic interdependence can create vulnerabilities. And this is one of the lessons of the pandemic. I'm very much interested how Europe is going to respond to.
Thank you, Ivan. I'm with you. Tim.
Someone once said problems aren't usually solved, they're just overtaken by other problems. And if you look at Europe over the last 10 years, one could think that in addition to Mariana Knoyer's list, one could add the Brexit crisis, the Trump crisis, the Ukraine crisis, and the Hungarian crisis. I'm with Ivan's cautious skepticism. I think I fear that the COVID crisis coming on top of the others is going to strengthen tendencies of fragmentation in the EU. I'd like to make two quick points. First is we should dwell on the really important point that Ivan made about the capacity of the EU to live with, and I would add, manage diversity. And my view is that the EU should be more relaxed about, better at managing cultural, social, and even policy diversity, but less tolerant of regime-type diversity. Whereas at the moment, it's almost the other way around. It's been extremely tolerant of regime-type diversity, witness Viktor Orban's Hungary, but too little tolerant of policy diversity and to some extent social diversity. And I do just want to emphasize that the existential character of the threat posed by Hungary. The question posed by Hungary is, can a dictatorship be a member of the EU? I'm not saying it's at the moment a dictatorship, but it's heading that way. It's certainly no longer a democracy. It's a competitive authoritarian regime. And I think that fundamentally undermines a core characteristic of the European Union as a community of democracies, as expressed in its treaties, and of course as a legal order. The other point I want to pick up on is Mariana Knoyer's very interesting one right at the beginning about maybe we aren't so polarized if we compare ourselves to the United States. It's a very interesting one, this. So you, in response, Michael, said, but look at Britain, Brexit, how polarized we are. Well, I have to tell you, Britain 2 years ago looked like an unbelievably and incurably polarized country. Leavers and Remainers, two tribes for the next 30 years, like the American North and the American South after the American Civil War. Not a bit of it. Almost all of that has gone. Not all, but a lot of it has gone. You could say it's because of COVID, but the fact is COVID in both Poland and the United States actually strengthened polarization. It became another cleavage issue between Trump supporters and Democrats. In Britain, it was the reverse. And then you have to ask, why is that? Why is polarization so extreme in the United States? And I think a crucial reason is the nature of the media landscape. In effect, there is no longer a shared public sphere in the United States. They're two quite separate public spheres. There's the world of MSNBC, NPR, and the New York Times, and the world of talk radio and Fox News, and each have their own sites on Facebook. And people live absolutely in two different realities. Whereas in Britain, we still have the BBC. 7 million people every morning listen to the same program on Radio 4. And so we still have the shared public sphere, shared facts, and actual exchange of opinions. So if you're asking how we prevent American-style polarization in our own countries in Europe, I think looking at the media landscape and working out how you preserve the public sphere that is essential to a liberal democracy is a crucial part of the answer.
Tim, I'm very, very happy to hear that, because you know that I love your country. The idea of Boris Johnson as a unifier is not self-evident, but maybe it's also worth pondering. But Olga, if I may, these are people of certain age. I don't want to, make too much of our chronological handicap, but you are of a different generation, and in the panel before you, Misha Šimečka, of the same generation in Slovakia, also gave us some sunnier outlook about the future of Europe. So, and it's a question we do have to address. How do we overcome the differences?
I think part of the answer has been already uttered, and that is overcoming the differences is really only possible when you have this common sphere. Unfortunately, the COVID crisis has been also linked to an increase in fake news, misinformation, disinformation. So really preserving media landscape that enables at least spreading the news that something is fake news is fundamental. So I would totally agree with what has been said on this. And just to illustrate this, at the moment, there is another battle for preserving this public sphere in the Czech television, Czech public broadcaster. And I've witnessed that it's a daily thing. It's something that has to be fought for really on a, not daily, but monthly basis. So this is how democracies die, slowly, very slowly, but the pressure is always there, that the public TV should be a bit more, a bit less independent, I'll put it this way. And then the second thing, the second way of overcoming differences is really admitting that they are okay in some ways and in some spheres. And that's exactly why I chose to use this original example of a thing that is very different in different countries in Europe, and that is attitude to how to raise babies, attitudes to how to take care of small children. Because there has been, I just give an example, there has been so much criticism on the Czech Republic from the EU because of the lack of some good things, such as places in kindergarten, in nurseries. that they forgot to mention that there are also good things in the way we take care of babies. And that's how I would like to put it. When we look at various European societies in their complexity, we can see that they do better in some respect, but maybe they fail in another thing. Maybe it's simply admitting that there is no great way of doing everything right would be a very good beginning.
Yes, there is also another very important difference. We don't have enough babies. I mean, you and I have done our share, but compared to some other parts of the world, we obviously facing a demographic problem, and it's not improving significantly, but we won't have the time to talk about it today. We have some questions on the Slido that I want to address. Anne is asking, Professor Garton-Ash, do you perceive Brexit as a failure of the European mutuality or rather a natural and not negative evolvement of European cooperation? It's a complex question, but you will know what to do with
briefly, it's a deeply unnatural development, Brexit, for sure. And I mean that in the sense that what we see now is a tendency to describe Brexit as some kind of inevitable result of deep historical forces that were always pulling Britain away from the European Union. And this is what the philosopher Henri Bergson called the illusions of retrospective determinism. The almost irresistible temptation to believe that what actually happened somehow had to happen. The fact is, if you look at the history of the referendum, if one or two conjunctural factors, like the leader of the Labour Party or the position taken by the Northern Irish Unionists, had gone the other way, it would have been 52 to 48 for staying in the EU, and then everybody would be telling a very different story about Brexit. That said, I think the important point for the European Union more broadly is not to write off Brexit as some kind of weird English eccentricity. There are some peculiar British causes, but there are also some causes that are quite generic that can be found in France or Germany or elsewhere in the European Union. And my own view is that the European Union hasn't taken the challenge posed by the fact of Brexit seriously enough. I don't think it's doing enough to address those causes. Let me just remind you, apropos of our discussion at the beginning, at the moment, Marine Le Pen is running neck and neck with Emmanuel Macron in the opinion polls in France. With luck in the second round, she'll just lose out again, but that's a staggering fact. So I think there are still many generic forces of Euroscepticism which we need to look at elsewhere in the EU.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, based on my previous experience as a psychologist, we know that it takes two people for a divorce, always, without exceptions. So we have about 5 minutes left, and that's your space for the famous last words about the divisions of Europe and its bright future. Who wants to start? I will rely on you, Professor Neuer, because you were the beacon of optimism in this debate.
Well, I hope I will not disappoint you now. Actually, I would raise, besides media, which I also find an important element, I would like to, at the end of this interesting discussion, maybe also point to the fact that polarization and divisions and fragmentation normally are reflected in party systems. So what we can find, and this is also an experience we have in the last years, is that the party systems in most European countries are confronted with this kind of fragmentation. We have more parties at the right, at the left. We have more new parties, maybe diffuse parties, which are difficult to ubicate ideologically, like Cinque Stelle in Italy. But the fact is that we have also reflected this diversity in our party systems. So why do I say that? Because I think as soon or as long and insofar we have this reflection of diversity in party systems in democratic standard parties, of course, in the party systems, this is something we should consider as, so to say, a natural and as democratic. So I think what we should get accustomed to, and this is a clear consequence of this polarization, of the divisions, and so on, of the fragmentation, is that we will have in the future, and this will be inevitable, we will have more plural, more fragmented party systems. We should get accustomed to this. But we also should consider this as an expression of the democratic will of the citizens. I mean, we should also maybe at the end of this discussion count in the citizens, because it's in the end the citizens who decide upon the leaders, the political leaders, but also about the parties. And again, as I think we should count with a more fragmented political landscape in terms of parties in the future.
Thank you. 30 minutes each now, 30 seconds each, I'm sorry. Ivan.
No, I just to make a very general point. Listen, of course Europe is divided, our societies are divided, but this is what politics is about. Managing these divisions. And the problem is how we're going to do it. And interestingly enough, polarization on one level can paralyze the system. On the other side, basically, polarization is the one that is changing certain type of a social consensuses. And in 10 seconds, give you the example. In general, Polish society had a quite conservative consensus about certain social issues, particularly sexual minorities and others. And now you have such a polarized political system that many people who even 2 or 3 years ago are going to be very critical about the gay rights, they're not going to say it anymore, because saying this means joining the government camp. And if these people feel on the side of the opposition, I don't know to what extent this has changed their view on the gay rights, but they're never going to politically attack them. So from this point of view, we have two different reasons. On one level, much more homogenization on the level of the political party supports constituencies, but on the other, how to basically help this polarization not to paralyze democratic system. This is the real question.
Deputy Richterová.
Yeah, I wish for Europe to be honest, to simply be able to own up to the mistakes we make inevitably, and not to focus on cultural differences, which was the point I tried to make, but on the institutions and on the fact that they must deliver. This is fundamental for democracy to stand to the test of delivering.
Amen to that. Tim.
I want to recommend pessimism as the best path to optimism. The most dangerous thing is complacency, and I think we still have too much complacency about the stability of the European Union. If you look at the late 1970s, people in the West thought things were going very, very badly, and that intellectual pessimism generated a period of incredibly dynamic radical reform. In the early 2000s, it was the other way around. We were complacent, we were hubristic, and that led us into this multiple series of crises. So I think some bracing intellectual pessimism, understanding how fragile the European achievement is, how many divides there are, multiple divides, will actually give us grounds for optimism. And by the way, our exemplar for that must be Václav Havel, who in some very dark times saw the possibility of much better Europe.
Well, I don't know if you've enjoyed this or if our audiences enjoyed this, but I certainly did. So thank you very much, Olga Richterová, Maria Neue, Ivan Krastev, and Tim Garton-Ash. Thank you from Prague.
Thank you.
We usually close this conference with a short cultural program to emphasize how much culture and arts represent the shared language, symbolics, and values at the root of the European identity, and also how inseparable they were from politics in the thought and work of Václav Havel. For this year's program, we have chosen one recently particularly troubled part of the other Europe, Belarus. We will first see the words and drawings of a young Belarusian artist from Minsk, a graduate of the College of Arts and Academy of Arts. She was imprisoned for 13 days after her participation in the protests against the manipulated election results in Belarus. Since the beginning of the protests in August 2020, more than 35,000 protesters have been arrested. Eliška Foukalová, the winner of the 13th annual Václav Havel Library competition for the best student's essay, will then read from her winning essay, Why Should We Care About Belarus? And finally, we will symbolically return to Václav Havel and his video salutation to the participants of the 2009 Belarusian European Forum.
Was turned off in the cells. It was daylight 24 hours a day. People were transferred from one cell to another, so me and my cellmates were infected with COVID-19.
These are the words and drawings of a young Belarusian artist from Minsk, a graduate of the College of Arts and Academy of Arts. She was imprisoned for 13 days after her participation in the protests against the manipulated election results in Belarus. Since the beginning of the protests in August 2020, more than 35,000 protesters have been arrested. The reported number of political prisoners until May 2021 is 360. More than 1,000 others are being held and judged for political reasons. In Belarus, one can get arrested for 30 days just for wearing symbolic red and white socks. The prisons are overcrowded. There are many reports of torture, and prisoners don't have proper access to medical care or contact with their families. Despite the regime's brutal reaction, pro-democratic protests and strikes continue. Let's not forget about the courage of the citizens of Belarus.
Mezi nihilismem a křížovou výpravou. Co je nám vůbec do toho? Do Běloruska, do Číny, do porušování lidských práv, do politiky. Lhostejno, jaký pojem si za to dosadíme, tato otázka padne v různých obměnách dříve či později v každé diskuzi o hodnotách a prioritách v politice. Za všemi těmito dotazy jakoby stála nevyslovená otázka jiná. Otázka po smyslu prosazování morálních hodnot. Vždyť prosazování hodnot a ideálů zní už ze své podstaty jako věc nesnesitelně nepraktická. Zatímco rezignace nabízí pohodlí, obhajoba hodnot na nás nakládá břemeno odpovědnosti a uvádí nás do neustálé nejistoty, neboť každá odpověď vede jen k novým otázkám a pochybnostem. Mají-li být totiž krásná slova o hodnotové politice proměněna v činy, musíme vědět, o jakých hodnotách mluvíme a ptát se po jejich zdrojích. A co hůř? Přijmeme-li nějaké hodnoty za své, jsme obtíženi povinností je hájet a přitom konfrontováni s pocitem vlastní bezmocnosti. Vždyť co zmůže jednotlivec a co zmůže malý národ tváří v tvář mocnostem, které po těchto hodnotách okázale šlapou? A nemůže se nám až příliš snadno stát, že se v zápalu boje sami zpronevěříme hodnotám, které jsme se rozhodli hájit? Jednotlivci i lidská společenství zakládají svá rozhodování na hodnotách, které nemohou nikdy zcela pragmaticky a racionálně obhájit. Bez základních hodnot totiž nemáme na čem stavět. Otázka, k čemu je hledat pravdu a snažit se jí podřizovat svůj život, se stává nesmyslnou, přijmeme-li pravdu jako základní kritérium všech svých činů. Pokud bychom se pokoušeli dokázat platnost morálních hodnot a ideálů na základě prospěchu, který nám, ať už jako jednotlivcům či jako státům, mohou přinést, znamenalo by to, že jsme si za své základní hodnoty zvolili sebestřednost a prospěchářství, jimž musí být vše ostatní podřízeno. Chceme-li být tedy důslední, pak na otázku, proč hájit lidská práva, existuje jen jediná odpověď. Protože je to prostě správné. Základní právo na lidskou důstojnost, svobodu a rovnost musíme nakonec vždy přijmout pouhou vírou. Nemůžeme si na ně sáhnout a nemůžeme si je vědecky ověřit. Hodnoty, na kterých se zakládá boj za demokracii a lidská práva, samozřejmě nespadly z nebe, ale byly formovány v rámci určité historické tradice, a to zejména tradice židovsko-křesťanské a řecko-římské. Proto se může jejich prosazování zdát mnohdy snazší ve státech, které prošly touto tradicí. Zároveň je však nebezpečné považovat hodnoty za pouhý sociální konstrukt. Když otcové zakladatelé USA mluví v deklaraci nezávislosti o tom, že všichni lidé jsou stvořeni sobě rovni a jsou obdařeni svým stvořitelem určitými nezcizitelnými právy, nejde o pouhý relikt doby, ale o zcela zásadní prohlášení o tom, že hodnoty demokracie a lidských práv lze považovat za univerzálně a neotřesitelně platné právě pro jejich transcendentní povahu. Jde tedy o to společně si uvědomovat duchovní rovinu sdílených hodnot a tak se vyvarovat toho, aby byly tyto hodnoty zadušeny laciným hokynářským počtářstvím a hodnocením všech rozhodnutí jen podle toho, zda v danou chvíli stanou se zdrojem materiálního zisku. Protože člověk, a tím spíše stát, který se vzdá univerzálních morálních hodnot kvůli dočasnému pragmatickému zisku, ztrácí i své vlastní zakotvení a tak nakonec ztrácí vše a nezískává nic. A protože nic se řekne latinsky nihil, pak je i neochota zastat se hodnot výrazem skutečného, politického i morálního nihilismu. Tyto hodnoty však nemohou být pouze deklarovány. Skutečné hodnoty se nepoznají podle toho, co si státy a mezinárodní společenství zapíší do ústav a zakládajících dokumentů. Identita států je určována ideály, které prosazují ve vztahu k druhým, nebo naopak prosazovat odmítají. Jsme-li tedy konfrontováni s otázkou, jak se postavit k pošlapávání lidských práv a demokratických ideálů ze strany běloruského, ruského, čínského či jakéhokoliv jiného autoritářského režimu, můžeme ji vnímat i jako podnět k tomu, objasnit si svoji vlastní identitu. Jsme-li totiž ochotni smířit se s brutálním potlačováním opozice a sfalšováním voleb v Bělorusku, kdo může zaručit, že bychom se s tím též nesmířili brzy u nás? Tyto režimy nám tak nastavují zrcadlo. Jejich počínání je výzvou k tomu říci si, které z hodnot zapsaných v naší ústavě a omílaných v projevech k velkým výročím skutečně vyznáváme a jsme ochotni je hájit a které jsou pro nás jen ozdobným přívěskem bez většího významu. Teď však kritického čtenáře jistě napadne otázka. Co pak mohu já jet do Běloruska a donutit Lukašenka k odstoupení? Co pak mohu já otevřít brány koncentračních táborů a zastavit genocidu Ujgurů v Xinjiangu? A zajisté je v takové námitce kus pravdy. Nejsme bohové, ani superhrdinové. A tak si musíme klást skromnější cíle. To však neznamená složit ruce do klína. Žijeme v systému demokracie a tržního hospodářství a tak můžeme vytvářet tlak na politiky i firmy jako voliči a spotřebitelé. Můžeme dát svůj hlas stranám ochotným zastat se demokracie a lidských práv a sami být občansky aktivní. Můžeme zodpovědně nakupovat, například s ohledem na informace o společnostech profitujících z nucené ujgurské práce. Nejsme přece odděleni od problémů světa. A tak přijetím odpovědnosti za druhé chráníme nakonec i sebe, abychom v okamžiku, kdy se sami ocitneme v ohrožení, nakonec s hrůzou nezjistili, že už není nikdo, kdo by se nás zastal. Kromě nebezpečí morálního nihilismu existuje i nebezpečí opačné, hrozba fanatismu a černobílého vnímání světa. Mohli bychom totiž začít považovat vlastní hodnoty za příliš samozřejmé a zcela přitom zapomenout, že i ony byly formulovány postupně v průběhu dlouhého historického vývoje. Hrozí nebezpečí, že budeme povýšeně a bezohledně zasahovat do států s odlišnou historickou tradicí. Pokud si totiž dovolíme pohodlně se zabydlet v hodnotách vymezených tvrdě podle schématu my a oni, hrozí nám, že skutečnou obhajobu hodnot nahradíme jen moderní obdobou křížových výprav či necitlivého koloniálního šíření civilizace. A přeci je naším úkolem právě ono balancování na hraně. Nemůžeme totiž ve jménu boje proti fanatismu, ve jménu tolerance a otevřenosti zrelativizovat všechny hodnoty. V zahraniční politice existují kroky, na jejich správnosti se lze snadno shodnout. Na druhé straně však stojí zejména vojenské zásahy, ke kterým je třeba přistupovat s maximální obezřetností, protože mnohdy přinesou víc škody než užitku. Je třeba nevzdat se klíčových hodnot, ale při jejich prosazování jednat s opatrností a nadhledem a hledat křehkou rovnováhu mezi rezignací a fanatismem. Tato esej si neklade za cíl představovat nějaký všeobecný návod pro hodnotovou zahraniční politiku. Tím méně pak konkrétní řešení situace v Bělorusku, v Hongkongu či kdekoliv jinde. Naivně jednoduchá řešení složitých problémů obvykle selhávají. Nechceme-li však zůstat zcela ztraceni v bludišti rezignace a nihilismu, musíme se poohlédnout alespoň po kompasu. Tím může být právě vědomí určitých základních hodnot. Pravdy, lásky, spravedlnosti a lidské důstojnosti. Hodnot duchovních a univerzálních a proto pevných a zavazujících. Konkrétní cesty a řešení už musíme hledat každý sám za sebe. Zapojit svůj rozum a stále znovu se kriticky ptát. Je třeba vzít tyto hodnoty vážně a nechat je promlouvat i skrze naše zdánlivě všední skutky. Jako jednotlivci především nemůžeme tuto odpovědnost za hodnoty přenechat pouze mocnostem či národu. Protože kdybychom to udělali všichni, skonal by národ asi velmi záhy. Neskonáli pak jedině proto, že tisíce jeho příslušníků budou boj za určité docela konkrétní hodnoty chápat, bez dlouhých řečí, jako svůj každodenní, aktuální a riskantní úkol. Úkol nikoli národní, ale prostě lidský. Připomíná Havel ve své polemice s Kunderou. Tento úkol je nesnadný. Vyžaduje od nás, abychom se vzdali svého pohodlí a přitom nás uvádí do neustálé nejistoty. Chce to důvěru a zároveň pokoru. Nepochybovat o pravdě a přitom se učit stále rozvíjet vlastní chápání pravdy. Jen tak se můžeme vyvarovat povrchního černobílého pohledu na svět. Je třeba stále hledat onu úzkou cestu mezi nihilismem a fanatismem. Ale právě tato absence jednoduchých řešení a neustálé hledání úzkých cest se zdá být naším údělem ve světě, který je fascinující svou složitostí i v lidském životě, který naplňuje smyslem právě ona svoboda a zároveň odpovědnost hledat pravdu a volit si cestu. Eliška Foukalová, Gymnázium Jana Keplera.
Dámy a pánové, vážení přítomní, dovolte mi, abych vás srdečně pozdravil a navázal tím na podporu, kterou se pokouším v rámci svých možností už po léta dávat všem svobodomyslným lidem v Bělorusku, kteří by rádi, aby i Bělorusko se vsadilo do rodiny demokratických evropských států. Kam bude Bělorusko patřit a jaký bude mít politický systém, záleží samozřejmě na občanech Běloruska především. Já sám ale si myslím, že jak geograficky, tak hodnotově Bělorusko patří do té rodiny evropských demokracií a pevně věřím, nebo byl bych rád, kdyby dříve či později opravdu jsme se setkali s běloruskými přáteli na půdě Evropské unie. Přeji vašemu setkání úspěch.
Well, that's all she wrote, as they say. Let me thank you all for staying with and participating in the Václav Havel European Dialogues 2021, and use this opportunity to invite you all to our autumn edition, this time from Brussels. These dialogues are not a one-off happening, but a process that will continue just as Europe and its values, ambitions, and questions will continue. Actually, one cannot exist without the other. My only hope is that next year, in the spring of 2022, we will be able to shake hands, share a meal, and enjoy the sunshine together. Until then, let's keep the dialogue open. Stay well and stay happy.